Welcome back! Today we're talking about the famous Anglo-Saxon epic, Beowulf. Beowulf is one of the most complex and rich pieces of Anglo-Saxon poetry that we still have. Anglo-Saxon, or Old English, is the language of the people who lived in England in the early Middle Ages. That is, from the time that Rome pulled out of England as the Angles and the Saxon tribes combined to create Anglo-Saxon, until the Battle of Hastings at 1066, when the Normans came over with William the Conqueror and brought the heavy influence of French into the English language. There's some fascinating studies in philology, or the study of language, through all of this. But our study here is about what makes this work about a guy arm wrestling monsters into such a masterpiece. The story of Beowulf is a story about what makes a hero from the Anglo-Saxon perspective. In fact, that's how we usually define epics. Epics are the great hero stories of a culture, showing the exploits and actions of what is the epitome of heroism to that culture. And in order to appreciate and engage with the text of Beowulf, I'd like to talk about the setting and cultural background of Beowulf, the poetic style of Beowulf, and a little bit of the history of how this poem has come to be regarded by critics as a very valuable piece of literature. To start with, let's look at the cultural backdrop. The story of Beowulf explores a time in history of contesting and clashing clans. Most of these are from Scandinavian countries. These clans are constantly at war, either beating each other or forming shaky alliances. And this story of monster fighting happens in the foreground of a lot of political tension. The world here is built around the mead hall, the king who sits on the throne and gives out gold and rings and treasure to his thanes. The thanes are the warriors who go out and use their prowess and their fighting ability to win honor for themselves as well as for their king and their culture. And we can see the heroism of this world being based on a couple of things. Number one, physical prowess. The agility and speed and strength and fighting ability, swimming ability, just general all-out physical awesomeness. And number two, generosity. A hero gives of what he has. And generally that comes out in, beating your enemies, taking what they have, and then sharing it with your clan. But along with the king, who is uniting the people, and the thanes who are doing the battle, we have the queen, who is the one who's able to ceremoniously express honor towards the thanes who most deserve it. We'll see a really great scene of that in Beowulf. And let's not forget the Shope, the bard, who sings the histories and the stories of the people so that they can keep a record and know who they are. Without that, they forget their genealogies. Without that, they forget their history, and they lose themselves. We should also note the intense violence of this culture. With the constant warfare between one clan and another, everything was always uncertain. That uncertainty comes out in the poem and in the culture as an intense sense of fatalism and pessimism. Doom is always lurking over the corner. The key word here is weird, an Anglo-Saxon word for fate. And you'll see as you look at the poem that each of the characters feel this looming sense of fate to everything that they do. And along with that violence as well, there was this constant sense of vendetta. Frequently, uneasy alliances would descend into violence as someone would kill someone else. And then it was the required duty of the family of that dead one to turn around and kill one of theirs. A vendetta justice, which usually led to rather intense cycles of violence. The one way out of this cycle of violence, other than the extermination of a whole clan, would be weregild. Weregild is the price for a man. So if you kill my brother, I can go and kill you, or I can ask for weregild, an offering of payment and peace instead of continued violence. The center of this life is the mead hall, where the king sits and where the thanes gather to eat and drink, and where the Shope would play his music and the queen would present her cup to the most honored thanes. This is a place of celebration, as we see in the beautiful mead hall Heorot in the poem. We're going to see several of these different clans who have tensions between them. The first we see are the Spear Danes, where King Hrothgar rules. We also have the Geats from southern Sweden, and that's where we meet Beowulf. North of them we have the Swedes, who are constantly clashing with the Geats. And since the Speardanes and the Swedes have something of an alliance going, it's complicated. Finally, we have the Heathobards in the background, who are having a big clash with the Speardanes. Okay, so let's look at the poetic style of Beowulf. What does Anglo-Saxon poetry look like? Well, first of all, it's written in Old English, which means that unless you study it, like Latin, you won't be able to read it. You may occasionally see a word that you think you recognize, but for the most part, it has to be studied separately, or in translation. There are many excellent translations, one of the more popular, Seamus Heaney, and of course, the excellent J.R.R. Tolkien, more of whom we will speak later, not to mention Burton Raffel, Howell Chickering, and many, many other excellent translations. I like to read a little bit from several translations so I get a feel for different ways that the translators play with the language. Most Anglo-Saxon poetry was originally composed as music and song, something for the shope to sing in the mead hall. Therefore, as part of the oral tradition, it probably changed and transformed over time. There are certain techniques within the poetry to help the shope's memory, notably the alliterative half-verse that Anglo-Saxon poetry is written in. The poetry is written in short half-lines with alliterative sound crossing between the half-lines to help trigger memories within the shope. Whit we gardena in gerdagam, theod sinninga thrim grifunen, hu tha ethlingas ilin frumden. You can hear in the very first line, gardena, girdagam, the alliteration of the G and D sounds. That linking of sounds connects the two half-lines. Next is the kenning. A kenning is a descriptive way of stating something that is very common, and it's used by pairing words in the Anglo-Saxon. So for instance, when talking about God, the poet calls him the life lord, pairing life and lord together. Not only is he lord and master, but he's also the giver of life, the lord of my life. Or at one point when Beowulf stands before Hrothgar and is about to give a big speech, he opens his word hoard, letting all those words out of storage. Or the very famous one about the ocean or the sea. Very early on in the poem, it uses a kenning which is frequently translated whale road, the road that the whales travel on. Tolkien hated this particular translation. He said that the hron at the beginning should not be a whale, but a smaller mammal, like a dolphin. And road was really not so much the hard-packed thing you travel on as the ride. So it should evoke, rather, the dolphins jumping beside the ship as you sail over the ocean. The dolphin riding. But you can see how striking these kennings can be, how they make you stop and appreciate the description of something very common that you see all the time. Yet they also function as a memory device, much like the heroic descriptors in, say, the Iliad or the Odyssey. Gray-eyed Athena. A third characteristic of the poetry is foreshadowing. We already mentioned that fate was a very significant concept within Anglo-Saxon culture. And the fatalism that sort of looms throughout the poetry, that sense of impending doom all of the time, comes out in very heavy passages of foreshadowing, usually foreshadowing destruction. Just in the moments when we get to see something beautiful, something wonderful being created, there's always that hint of doom underneath it all. Fourth, litotes, or litotes, understatement. Unlike the Romantics, who tended to gush and gush in their description of things, the poetry of the Anglo-Saxons tends to be very understated, somewhat heavily ironically so at times. It's almost as though if you're having a conversation with someone you deeply, deeply love, who means the entire world to you, you say, you know, I don't hate you. That's how a lot of this poetry comes across. There's a kind of verbal irony to the understatement here. A great example of litotes is in the middle of one of these really horrific fights when Grendel's mother grabs Beowulf and has him pinned down and is dragging him down into the deeps, into her lair. It says, he was not at all spirited about that. That just didn't feel that great, you know? Another interesting thing about Anglo-Saxon poetry, and particularly the poetry of Beowulf, is the blend of cultural influences. And particularly within Beowulf, the way there's a balance between two cultures. These Scandinavian clans have pagan cultural roots, and you can hear them all throughout the poem, connected to Norse mythology as well as other iterations of that myth. Interesting linkages to various Scandinavian mythologies, including the ones that we're still very familiar with, such as Woden and Thor. But there's also the influence of Christianity that came with the Romans, the monasteries throughout England. And in fact, the monasteries being places of learning, where they were literate and able to read and write, frequently took the oral tradition poetry and composed it and wrote it down. With Beowulf, we see the pagan poetry fed through the worldview of Christianity. And yet, unlike some medieval Christian monks who would have erased every vestige of what they saw as pagan and evil, the poet of Beowulf creates a beautiful balance between the two. This was the argument of J.R.R. Tolkien, when in his famous paper in the 1930s, he moved Beowulf from a fringe study of language and culture and history to a study rich in the appreciation in poetry. It's this master craftsmanship, Tolkien argues, that shows this balance between the Christian worldview of the poet and the pagan ideas of the past. The poet is still able to view these people as heroic, even though their worldview is different than his. He does this in three ways. One is to use lots of references to the Old Testament of the Bible, but almost no references to the New Testament. In this way, these pagan heroes seem to fit the old world, the pre-Christian world of the Old Testament. And they have a kind of unchristianized faith. After all, several of them are clearly monotheistic and believe in some kind of creator god. And so the Christian poet manages to square his love of Hrothgar and Beowulf in this way. Second, the poet does erase all of the names of the Scandinavian gods from Beowulf, except for a few places where he may not have recognized them as gods. But he still retains references to a kind of creator god. As Woden is frequently called the All-Father, he seems to stand in as a central creator god. And that works pretty well with the Old Testament kind of sensibility. Finally, some critics have read into certain passages in Beowulf a kind of Christian allegory. Is it possible that this poet was writing Christian lessons and allegory into the poem of Beowulf? It's possible, but it's definitely not overstated either. There's some interesting links to Beowulf as a Christ figure towards the end of the poem, but the poet definitely wasn't explicit about it. So, the poem is rich and meaningful. And not only that, it's a lot of fun. It's a guy who's out there fighting monsters, trying to show his heroism. It's action-packed, it's dramatic, it's got really fantastic lessons built into it. And let's face it, who doesn't love a bunch of giant man-eating monsters? Thanks for watching. Through the next several episodes, we will analyze and discuss Beowulf and have a whole lot of fun doing so. You can click to subscribe or watch another video, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.